Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
Let's welcome our first guest. She's waiting patiently to chat with us. She's an investigative journalist, photographer and a member of the Syrian Solidarity Movement Steering Committee. I mentioned earlier, she testified last week before the UN Human Rights Council about the targeting of Yemeni civilians by Saudi Arabia, something which is getting scant coverage in British and in US media. I'm not saying it isn't, I'm saying scant coverage. It gets the occasional mention. It's left to The Independent and The Guardian really to mention it at all. She's also a regular contributor to 21st Century Wire, and you can read her regularly on the blog thewallwillfall.wordpress.com. Let's welcome back to the programme Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa, welcome back.
Oh, hi Richie, thank you for having me back.
It's great to have you back. It's a terrible subject to be talking about. It's horrible. Yeah. It's horrible to see Philip Hammond in Georgia talking about the Russian government and how much of a threat to world security they are and how dangerous they are, while we have tripled, and I say we, I mean the British government and British arms manufacturers have tripled in the last 5 months our arms sales to Saudi Arabia, despite people like you and others in Amnesty International and in the Human Rights Watch organisation telling the British government as far back as last autumn that the Saudis were killing children, were killing women and were bombing hospitals.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned to you, I was asked to testify at the UN HRC 31st session on this subject, particularly on the, as you mentioned, thanks Richie, the illegal use of cluster munitions by the Saudi coalition, which have been supplied almost exclusively by the United States, the CBU-105, both ground rockets and air missiles. Now, I don't know how much your listeners know about cluster munitions, but fundamentally these kind of hideous bombs can contain up to 2,000 submunitions, or what we call bomblets or skeets. Mid-air, the outer casing explodes and releases these thousands or hundreds of bomblets, which then are scattered over an incredibly big area, up to 30 acres. Now, these weapons are designed really to pierce armor plating. They're for use against tanks, against armored vehicles. They're incredibly, incredibly destructive. And actually, talking to Patrick Henningsen the other day, something that I didn't realize is that they actually score the casing so that when it disintegrates into these kind of razor-sharp shrapnel pieces, which even if you just touch them, will slice through your flesh. So it doesn't take a lot of imagination to picture the effect that these missiles are going to have on civilian areas. And although the United States is a non-signatory of the Cluster Munitions Convention, which outright bans their use or their transfer or their stockpiling, they do have their own export regulations, which state very clearly that they should only ever be used on military targets. And the other regulation they have is that the submunitions should have, and I hate this wording, a less than 1% failure rate, which basically means that less than 1% of, let's say, those 2,000 bomblets should remain unexploded. When they remain unexploded, again, just to explain, they then become de facto landmines, which become an even bigger threat for decades after any conflict. Children rummaging around in the rubble or playing in agricultural land, or livestock as well, will stumble on these bomblets, pick them up, play with them, and then they detonate. And that's when you get the amputations, the maiming, the disfiguring that we would normally associate with landmines, but we can now sadly associate with cluster munitions.
Nobody knows anything about this because it's not reported on. Right. It's as simple as that, isn't it? As far back as December, we were talking on this programme about the comments made by Zaid Rad Al Hussein, who said that there was clear evidence, irrefutable evidence, that a disproportionate number of attacks coming from Saudi Arabia were hitting and killing civilians. Unbelievable, using the horrifying munitions you described there. And that's a horrifying reality, that to be on the ground or to be anywhere near where, so the Saudis are saying, well, we're targeting some guys over there, so we're going after them, we're going after these terrorists, these rebels. And you could be 2 to 3 miles away. And as you quite rightly described, they fire out this thing out of a helicopter, out of a plane. It breaks up in midair and sends basically bombs. It's like cluster bombs going everywhere in all different directions. This is hell on earth, this, for these people there, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, there was one particular story that I'd been looking into because the photographs of these 2 little boys were so horrifying that I basically asked somebody to try and get me more details. Basically, the photograph that I posted today was of 2 little boys, Abdu and Marwan. Their skin, I don't know if you remember the photographs in Vietnam of the children that had been napalmed.
Yeah, I do, yeah.
And that's how I can best describe it to your listeners. Just so that you know also, cluster munitions can contain chemical agents like napalm, like white phosphorus. In fact, Israel used them at the end of the war with Lebanon. They were used in Japan. I think then it was called the M69. I'm not a weapons expert, so I'm quite happy for someone to correct me on the nomenclature. But these 2 boys in this photograph just broke my heart. They were basically targeted in May last year, along with their entire family, in an area bordering Saudi Arabia in Hajjah in the north of Yemen. 12 members of their family were massacred in this cluster bomb strike. Their father, their mother, their siblings, and all of their close relatives. These 2 boys survived for a further 2 weeks, basically living, I've been told, underneath a tree for shelter with no food, no water, no accessibility to any hospitals which had already been pre-bombed, particularly in the north by the Saudi coalition, to prevent any sort of sustenance or survival, particularly again in the north, in the areas of Sada and Hajjah that are, if you like, the Ansarullah strongholds. So after 2 weeks of sort of clinging onto life, really in this sort of dreadful condition, these boys died. And this is only one story. It's only one example.
It's not the exception, Vanessa. This is the horrifying reality. It's not the exception.
We're talking 8,000 people. Over 8,000 people have been massacred, Richie, and there's figures between 15,000 and 30,000 are injured. And I'm not talking, scratches. I'm talking amputees. I'm talking serious internal wounds. I'm talking people that have been bombed in wedding parties, in their own homes, in mosques, in schools, in hospitals. I mean, early on there was a premature baby hospital that was struck. There is nothing that can explain or excuse or justify this level of brutality and just vicious war of aggression that is being supported not only by the United States, that, as we said, is supplying the cluster weapons, cluster munitions, but also by our own government in the UK, who are supplying, we know that they're supplying smart missiles, cruise missiles, that have been used, again, against civilian targets, mostly factories, but civilian targets, and it's civilians that have been killed. They have certainly not been a military target in any way, shape or form.
Can I just come in on that? I spoke with Norman Baker on the programme last night. He's obviously, you know who he is. He's a former Home Office Minister. Yeah. He was a Home Office Minister under the last coalition government. He lost his seat to a Conservative woman. I think she's an Irish woman, actually, who's a nurse who won his seat. But anyway, long story short, I obviously put it to him last night, should the British Prime Minister and the ministers who signed off on those arms sales, knowing full well what they were being used for, should they be interviewed, and should they be interviewed under caution? And he said they should do. And I was thinking of you today, and I was going to pull a stunt today. I was going to ring the Metropolitan Police today, identify myself, and ask could I report the crime effectively. But then I thought it would only be a stunt. It would be wrong to record people and not tell them they're being recorded. And if I did tell them they were being recorded, they would hang up anyway. So there was going to be no joy in it. But I thought, what if I was to ring up the Metropolitan Police and say, look, this isn't a hoax. I want to make a serious complaint. We know through international human rights organisations that weapons we're signing off on to go to the Saudis have been used to kill children. Therefore, David Cameron, Sajid Javid, I must say, and Philip Hammond are accessories after the fact. Vanessa, if I send a handgun or a knife to one of your neighbours, and I know that your neighbour hates you, and I know that there's a very, very, very good chance you're going to be attacked with that knife, I'm as guilty as the person who uses the knife. And I was going to do it today, and I thought, no, it'll come across as a stupid stunt. Don't do it. I might do it tomorrow, not record it, and just write down everything that's said. Basically, I want to report a crime here. And I want a crime number. I want you to acknowledge the report of the crime, and I want you to, to interview the people I've mentioned. Of course, they're not going to do it. But I suppose if 100,000 of us did it, or if 10,000 of us did it.
Yeah. I mean, at the moment, there is, I'm guessing you are aware that on the 10th of March 2016, the law firm Lee Day, representing Campaign Against Arms Trade, began formal legal action in the High Court to challenge the government's decision to export arms to Saudi Arabia. Obviously, this is on the back of the sort of insurmountable evidence that Saudi forces are violating international human law in Yemen using UK-supplied weapons. Now, where the UK has been particularly cute, and I mentioned that in my argument, is if you actually study all of their contracts, they won't actually say, for instance, that they supplied PGM-500 Hakim cruise missiles. They'll say that they've supplied components for ground-to-air missiles, components for fighter jets, components. So everything is described as a component. So obviously that could also mean a screwdriver, right, or a hammer.
Yeah.
So, their obscurantism, if you like, is extraordinary. I mean, these people should be in the dock for war crimes, obviously not only in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, but Yemen at the moment is suffering such an unbelievable laying waste of their entire culture, their civilization. I mean,
do us a quick favour, Vanessa. Sorry to cut across you there. Do us a quick favour. We always assume knowledge, don't we? And not to be patronising anybody. Obviously, the audiences who listen to independent media programmes tend to be a little bit more clued up than those who watch Sky or the BBC. We know that. But at the same time, there will be people listening and they might be thinking, what's going on in Saudi? Who are the Houthi rebels? Excuse me, in Yemen, I should say. What's that all about? Do you want to give us the Cliff Notes version of what's happening?
Yep, I certainly can. In fact, that was part of our testifying at the UN, and I'll crib a little bit from the statement of Mohammed Al-Wazir, who's a Yemeni lawyer based in Washington, D.C., who basically talked about the background of the conflict and how it's a completely amoral, illegal, and illegitimate war against Yemen. Basically, I'm sure that everybody is aware that the UK, the US, and the Sauds are constantly propagating this myth that they're defending the legitimacy of the president in exile, Mansour Hadi. Well, just to kind of blow that myth apart, Hadi actually resigned on January the 22nd, 2015, and he didn't withdraw his resignation. He left Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen, for Aden, which is on the coast. And from there, he was driven out by fundamentally his own army, not even the Houthis, his own army. We have to understand the Houthis that everybody keeps talking about, the Houthi rebels that are purportedly creating this civil war environment in Saudi Arabia by demanding representation for themselves. This is another myth. The Houthi rebels as such are less than 1% of the population, Rich. So how can 1% of a population of 27 million be creating as much protesting and demonstration against Saudi neocolonialism fundamentally. So that's another myth to dispel there. So Hadi basically fled as a fugitive. He fled his own country, but then went to Riyadh, where he went on camera basically demanding that the Sauds bomb his own country and his own people to reinstate him as the legitimate president. So can you see how incredibly, cowardly, but how incredibly hypocritical this was? He resigned. He refused to rescind his resignation. And then when he realized what was going on, and probably when pressure was put upon him by Saudi Arabia because they didn't want to lose their puppet regime in Yemen, he then performed this cowardly act and called, if you like, the dogs onto his own people. With
the blessing of Tel Aviv and Washington, D.C., of course. Yeah.
Of course, absolutely. And I mean, we'll try to cover very quickly the reason, the geopolitical importance of Yemen, not only to Saudi Arabia, but also to the States and probably also to the UK. I'll try and cover that very, very quickly. Another thing that is very often overlooked and ignored, particularly by the Western media, is that when Operation Desert Storm, is it Desert Storm? No.
Which one? Iraq War 1?
No, I always get mixed up with them because they're actually so similar. It's Decisive Storm.
Decisive Storm.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I would have made the same mistake, yeah. Don't worry about it.
Well, it goes to show precisely where that naming of the operation comes from anyway. But basically what was happening just before this war of aggression on Yemen started, and even the UN envoy Jamal Benomar has stated that when this campaign started, and I'm quoting him now, one thing that was significant but went unnoticed is that the Yemenis were close to a peace deal that would institute power sharings with all sides, including the Houthis. The Houthis were only looking for proportional representation, and the Yemeni people were looking for an end to corruption, an end to Saudi neocolonialism and opportunism in their country, and an end to the ceaseless corruption that had ensured, this incredible class divide in Yemen. And basically, Yemen was potentially setting itself up to be, to a huge extent, a democracy, a confederal state system, north and south, existing within a federal state. Now, another thing to make clear here, that under Hadi, and again, you will pick up on this, that it will serve the Zionist agenda as well as the Saudi and US agenda. Hadi, under Saudi tutelage, was trying to impose a complete balkanization of Yemen. In other words, dividing it into 6 sectarian states, with the Ansarullah or the Houthi state in the middle, devoid of any resources. So again, there was already sort of oppression of any opposition, which we know to be part and parcel of the Saudi regime. And certainly this form of sectarianism and partitioning, we also know will always serve best Israel in the region, because as long as countries are divided into sectarian parcels and are battling each other on their own borders, they're not going to bother Israel, right? And again, by proxy, this benefits the United States and its allies. So that's a little bit to the background. As soon as Yemen started to emancipate itself, it was bombed. It was bombed.
Can I ask you a couple of questions on Twitter, because I want to acknowledge the tweets coming in. Jane tweets this: Lockheed Martin has quadrupled production of laser-guided bombs and Hellfire missiles, according to the News Target website. That wouldn't surprise me. Jane, I didn't see that story. Colm is listening in Dublin. Colm says, Vanessa, when you're reporting to the United Nations and they're monitoring this massacre, what are we going to do about it in terms of what are the UN going to do about it? And this comes up all the time on programmes like this when the United Nations is mentioned, what it really is, what it was set up for, and how impotent it ultimately is when it comes to these situations, as we've seen. But of course, that doesn't mean, Colm, that it's not the right thing to do to go on the record and report on these abuses, these human rights abuses, as Vanessa has done. You've got to do that and then leave it up to the United Nations. But it is, it's a paper, it's a nothing organisation, Vanessa, isn't it?
Of course it is, yeah. And I mean, I've written another article about the famous "we decry, we lament, we condemn, but we do nothing." This is the classic UN statement. But just in response to that, because I have to say, for me, always commentating on the sidelines and very much criticising the UN ineffectiveness, if you like, or impotence, and to be in the belly of the beast, if you like, and actually seeing it from inside was an interesting experience. But one thing I will say is that these sort of bearing witness to the atrocities that are being committed globally, it may not have an effect on the UN de facto. But what it does do is, one, it raises morale in Yemen. Yemen has been completely ignored, forgotten, marginalized as a conflict. And for them to see people standing up and speaking about what is happening, because we were live streamed to about 72 Arab channels, including Al Masira in Yemen. So they saw us doing this. And as was described by somebody living there, he said, it's like giving a dying man a cup of water in the desert.
Yeah.
It just makes us feel that somebody is listening, somebody is watching, and somebody is reporting. So I don't think that should ever be undervalued.
Never, or underestimated. Absolutely.
No,
yeah.
absolutely
Huge.
not. And I think, one of the positive things that I took away was not necessarily that I believe that the UN is going to do anything or that it's going to uphold its own charters. Yes, it talked about the cluster munitions in the closing speeches. Yes, of course, it said, this is appalling. This is, it can't continue. But we've heard them saying this about Palestine, about West Sahara, about pretty much everywhere in the world for decades. So I'm not putting much store by that. But one person I spoke to in the UN was a lawyer called Jan Furman, who's a member of the International Association for Democratic Lawyers based in Brussels. And what I saw Brussels doing was quite extraordinary. I mean, he was calling powerfully in his statements for boycotting, divesting, arms embargoes on Saudi Arabia. They're working in Brussels on initiatives within the Muslim community to basically end the infiltration by Saudi Wahhabi agents, extremist agents, in other words. So they're actually really kind of taking the bull by the horns and dealing with the situation and calling for the things that we should be calling for in the UK and in Central Europe. Having said that, of course, France has just signed another deal for, I think, about 6.7 billion with Qatar, who is part of the Saudi-led coalition bombing Yemen.
Which, of course, is in the news today because migrant workers are treated like slaves in Qatar. We know this. Although it must be said, find a country in the world that doesn't violate human rights and you can have a World Cup or a soccer event there, but you might be looking for a long time to find a country that hasn't committed human rights abuses against its citizens. And by the way, I'm including the Republic of Ireland in that.
Yeah.
This is the horrors of it. Yes, by all means, we should absolutely have a go at Qatar and what it does, and Dubai as well, and everywhere else. But you're absolutely right to mention that. Can I just say this? We've got about 6 or 7 minutes left,
sure.
and I want you to finish up on Yemen, but I do want to just divert you just for a second. You will know Vanessa. By the way, folks, Vanessa Beeley is on the line. It's terrific having her on the show. Check out thewallwillfall.wordpress.com. I've tweeted that out already. This is real journalism, by the way. It really is. You don't see this on Channel 4 or Sky or the BBC. This is real journalism. Going to a region, documenting it, photographing it, interviewing people, forming an opinion based on that, and then sharing it with people. It's the essence of journalism. It's as simple as that. I'm in absolute utmost, I have the utmost admiration for it, I really do. Senator Patrick Leahy, as you probably know, Vermont Senator, has basically written to John Kerry and asked him to investigate Israel basically the IDF shooting people dead, unarmed Palestinians or Palestinians that have already been arrested. He managed to get 10 co-signees of the letter. None of his compatriots in the Senate actually signed it. Absolute cowards. None of them did. I suppose we shouldn't be surprised by that. And he said, we want you, Leahy said to Kerry, to ask some serious questions of the extrajudicial killings of Palestinians by the IDF. Benjamin Netanyahu came out today and said, what did he say exactly? Something along the lines of that it doesn't go on. IDF soldiers don't execute Palestinians, he says. What I thought was extraordinary, Vanessa, is that it's only been 4 days or 5 days since we saw that video that emerged, which RT shared, and it went around the world, of the Palestinian man, 2 Palestinian men, one being stretchered into an ambulance, the other guy lying on the ground, semi-conscious, and he had his head blown off by an IDF soldier. That's a special type of maniacal liar, isn't it? That will say only days after the world sees an IDF soldier murder an unarmed man, it takes a special kind of madman to say, we don't do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's more and more these days. I mean, I was reading a report just before I came on, but about Michael Fallon, another gem in the UK government. And, the headline basically reads that he's defending Saudi Arabia's legitimate right to defend themselves. Now, where does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah.
You know, and the UK supports the peace process. I mean, this is all sounding horribly familiar, right? And if we look at what I'm seeing more and more now, is this coming together of Saudi Arabia and Israel, whereas obviously Saudi has always to some extent been viewed as the Islamic Republic. But in fact, now we're seeing how close Wahhabism and Zionism actually is. I mean, if we look at the execution rate, which is the highest in the world in Saudi Arabia, I mean, I think in 2015 they executed 157. In 2016, we're already at 80. Now, bear in mind, Bin Naif, who's the interior minister who actually determines who is to be executed, is the guy that Francois Hollande gave the Légion d'honneur to, just as a little aside.
Yeah.
For services against terrorism, which they kind of created in the first place. Like, you know, like, I don't know about you, but sometimes I just feel like I've woken up in another dimension entirely.
How do you get out of bed then, knowing that? How do you do what you do, you and others?
See, I don't know. It's just like I have to abandon all rationale sometimes when I kind of start investigating these people, because they appear to have no conscience, or at least I struggle finding it.
You know what my great friend and great supporter David Icke thinks, that they're existing in a different world altogether. And it's something I used to laugh at and dismiss many years ago. I certainly don't anymore. We've got a couple of minutes left. I want to give you the absolute last word. Take a couple of minutes, Vanessa, and tell us about Yemen. What can I mean, I know listeners to this are going to be feeling helpless. When they hear you describe those children, you know, going to live the rest of their lives missing a leg or an arm, if they're lucky, that is, if they haven't been blinded by the Saudis. Give us a bit of hope. What can people do? What can people do here listening to this?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things they can definitely do is to support any form of legal action being taken against our own government, and certainly demonstrate, if they can, if there are any demonstrations going on against the military-industrial complex, please join in, do what you can, write to them, lobby them. Lobby your MP, lobby, you know, anybody you can think of. The other thing, directly in Yemen, I wouldn't normally promote NGOs or charity organizations because normally they have so many affiliations with state somewhere along the line. But there is one grassroots NGO, Mona Relief, MONA, Dr. Karim, and I have to say that I've been speaking to them for quite a while now. They only survive on public donations. What they do for the people in Yemen is extraordinary. I mean, they get shot at, bombed, attacked every day that they're out there trying to provide basic medical equipment and supplies, because as you know, the other problem with Yemen is that they're under full blockade. UN Resolution 2216 was an arms embargo against 5 people in Yemen, 5 people, 2 of which were previous President Ali Abdullah Saleh and the leader of the Houthis, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, and 3 other antagonists by Saudi standards. But that 2216 resolution has been used to enforce a full humanitarian blockade on Yemen. So there is no food getting into Yemen, nothing. No humanitarian aid is getting into Yemen. So these guys at Mona Relief are doing an unbelievable job of distributing what is left to areas that have been either bombed into oblivion or completely cut off from the outside world.
Send us a link, Vanessa, and we'll tweet it out. Folks, go to thewallwillfall.wordpress.com. Don't leave it so long to get back in touch with us again, Vanessa. Thanks for your terrific journalism. There's 2 types of people who do the work that you do. There are those who do it because they want to attract attention to themselves and they use people as their props. And there are genuine, heartfelt, brilliant journalists like you who are doing it for the right reasons. And thanks for doing it, and thanks for coming back on the programme.
Oh, bless you, Richie. Thank you for having me. Thank you on behalf of Yemen, because that's one thing for people as well. Please, via social media, just keep Yemen in people's minds and hearts. It's so important. It's important for the Yemeni people, but it's important for their salvation, basically.
It certainly is. Vanessa Beeley, thank you very much.